you just step off the step stool. I wheel over there. I collect the step stool, put it in my lap, and wheel away. You're hanging. There's no evidence.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
It does make perfect sense. You get the Costco folding step stool.
Right. Those are the best step stools, by the way. If you don't have one, go buy they'll last you forever.
Welcome back to Shat on TV Watchmen, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the hit HBO series Watchmen. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me are my two co-hosts, the King Bee.
Hello, friends.
And Roger Roper.
I'm sorry, William, but this sort of thing isn't really the Minutemen's cup of tea.
And this is our deep dive edition where we look back on this week's episode of Watchmen and provide our thoughts and analysis. This week's episode was titled This Extraordinary Being. Raj, what'd you think?
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this episode like I've done most of the season. You know, sometimes it can be difficult to do an entire flashback episode while keeping the style and theme of the overall series, but I feel like they did this one masterfully. You know, they tied in the nostalgia, effects, storyline, you know, kind of artfully moving from one memory to another. You guys talked about it on the Instacast, how you were a little afraid that it could be a fever dream with lots of quick takes and quick cuts, and it would feel more disjointed. But I really loved how they moved from one memory to another, showcasing both Angela and Will seamlessly in Hooded Justice's point of view. I feel like, unlike other episodes this season, which may lend to some of the feedback we've received on Twitter, it was very straightforward. You know, it answered or solidified a lot of our suspicions and questions that we had earlier in the season. So there weren't a lot of new mysteries like other episodes have, but overall, dare I say, it was an extraordinary episode.
Well, we're glad you're here for the deep dive. King B, you were with me on the Instacast last night within a half hour of watching episode 6. Now that you've had a whole day to digest it, anything new that stood out to you, or what did you think of the episode?
You know, I probably spend 3.5 hours, give or take, exploring a 45-minute episode of TV. And there's still just so much to unpack in this episode. Will Reeves as a character, I think, is really fascinating. There's so much going on internally. We could do really a whole podcast on all of his internal struggles displayed on this episode. And we'd never have time to get to all the external shit that's going around in the world that he lives in. I'm still just way into this show. I'm fascinated by this character. I can't wait to see what's coming next. Crossover alert. You might recognize the racist grocer, warehouse owner, as the inbred murderer in that first season of True Detective, one of our other Shat podcasts. He's also got a great scene in the movie God's Pocket, which is borderline unwatchable. But overall, great episode.
You know, I couldn't quite place it, but he did look familiar. And this is a weird thing to say, but he looked better in True Detective.
As the inbred murderer?
Follow me, little prince.
Versus a racist market owner? Yeah, I could see it.
He's got an amazing fight scene in God's Pocket where two Italian goons go to rough him up, and he just takes them apart.
That was my nickname in high school.
Racist goons?
No, God's Pocket. While I was watching this episode, I started thinking, as much as I appreciate the show and the cutting edge stuff it's doing, the controversial topics it's touching on, what if I wasn't a person of my particular political persuasion or my particular non-religious conviction? How would this strike me? And you got to remember that Watchmen has a writing room that has a lot more women than usual, more women directors than usual, seeing things from a perspective that does believe in institutional racism, that does believe in generational hardships. And I try to view it through that prism to see if the show looked any different to me. And I could see where this episode might, to some viewers, seem a little heavy-handed in depicting racist violence and social issues. Like, it's very overt. It's out there. But I think it's done intentionally. The more I chewed on it, the more I appreciated episode 6 as a standout episode when it comes to TV overall, not just this series. I think Alan Moore with the graphic novel back in the 80s, he opened that door from squeaky clean comic books into the grit and depravity of what real costumed adventurers would look like with their human flaws. And I think Lindelof is kind of carrying that torch and pushing that even further, showing that we're all fucked up. Like, we're all pinned in a box. We're all the product of our environments, and no uniform or pedigree or deeds will change that.
I'm glad that you brought that up. I think it's pretty fascinating. After Alan Moore did start this grim and gritty superhero trend, there were a lot of imitators, books like The Brat Pack and The One, even the Swamp Thing stuff that came later by Rick Veitch, that's the author's name. A lot of it was very gruesome. It was dirty. It was very adult, but I think a lot of it mostly teamed on like sexual depravity and things like that. Cheers to Lindelof for not really swimming in that so much as showing a lot more societal grit that's taking place here.
I disagree with there being too heavy-handed in racist violence or social issues, because, the American society that we're living in here has struggled and has grown up. And then thankfully we live in a generation where we didn't live in a time where people would attack students for trying to get into a university, or attack individuals for sitting at a counter at a soda fountain and try to get a refreshment, or, had the water hose turned on them and had nipping dogs barking at them because they tried to protest for, the same rights that white people did. So, while we think that's a little heavy-handed, this stuff really actually happened. And, this show is, I think, been brave and not to shy away with it, and also bring some of our sordid past to light that maybe was glossed over in history books.
So what we have in store for you on today's podcast will be a pretty in-depth discussion of what we saw. As Raj said, this was a straightforward episode, but it doesn't mean it was a shallow episode. There was a lot going on there. Immediately after we put out the Instacast, I rushed onto Twitter and noticed that tons of people were talking and praising the music choices in this episode. So the King Bee is going to tackle that. We're also going to talk about some Reeves veals. Basically, a lot of people also looked at this episode and said, we knew all this stuff already. And I beg to differ. And I've got a few things, and Raj does as well, that we think were pretty outstanding about this episode that told us a lot about this world and about our world. We're also going to get into how Watchmen gets under the mask, how it digs even deeper than Alan Moore did. And Raj is going to take a stab at telling us what we don't know about Lady Trieu. She appears late in this episode, and there's a lot going on there. We were left to question how the hell Angela got into her compound. She definitely seems to be playing a major role in episodes 7 through 9, so there's going to be a bit of a preview of that. And we'll end with a few odds and ends, just things that didn't quite fit into any buckets, but definitely deserve to be talked about very briefly. Again, if you haven't listened to our podcast before, we do this all in buckets, so it's not going to be a scene-by-scene breakdown of the episode, but instead we're going to talk about major themes. And if you'd like to write in about these themes, you can write us at hosts@shatontv.com so we can see your ideas and hopefully respond to them on the podcast later this week. So let's kick off King Bee with these music choices. There was nostalgic music, which kind of fits the theme. So what'd you hear on this episode?
Yeah, well, Sister Night definitely has her theme song every time she, opens a closet door or walks down the hallway or gives somebody dirty looks. Her grandfather, William Reed, definitely has his own soundtrack as well. You first notice the sort of drum roll that's playing when he's about to be sworn in as an officer. It's this high intensity, high speed thump when he first dons his mask and fights these muggers in the alley. Later, you're going to catch it when he catches his son, painting his face white and dressing up in his costume. All these drum beats, the staccato beat and tempo really mirror the intensity of what Will is obviously feeling in the moment. You've got that drum roll, that sort of just on the edge of your seat excitement when he's getting his badge pinned on his shirt, down to just the intense starts and stops when he's filled with anger and rage and humiliation when he sees his son kind of emulating him.
And I'm glad you pointed that out, because I couldn't put my finger on it when I was watching the episode, but there was a great deal of tension in these moments. And I felt myself a bit pumped up, like getting ready for it to go. And really fantastic work by both Jovan Adepo, who played William Reeves, and also Regina King. There was a lot of acting being done under a hood or just with the eyes showing. And that combined with the soundtrack was fascinating to watch. It gave me all the feels.
Next up, I think one of the most obvious sounds that you get out of this episode is that song, I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire. It was recorded in 1941 by a vocal group called the Ink Spots.
Oof.
Yeah, I think everyone who learns this instantly cringes. I mean, just think for a minute about that name for a group of African Americans touring as a vocal group. Contemplate the fucking grin and bear it bullshit that these men had to endure just to make a living in the 40s. Gene had a tweet earlier this week about emotional labor, and I think it really rings true here. Anyway, the lyrics to this song, darling, I only have one desire, and that one desire is you. And I know nobody else ain't going to do. This notion of having no other ambition than this one singular pursuit, it's playing while he's savagely beating 3 white supremacists within an inch of their lives. It really lends credence to my claim that all these heroes are these wildly violent, cruel characters, really, on the inside, despite this altruistic nature that they're displaying.
Yeah, and I think that's confirmed by his wife, saying you've got something dark inside you. And I thought that being a vigilante would help almost kind of meditate you and get this out of your system, but all it's done is feed the beast. And so they're really, as I was watching, I was like, damn it, the king bee is right here, where he says, when he says that these vigilantes have something deep and dark inside them, and that's the reason that they put on the mask. I think the only character that maybe bucks that trend is the original Night Owl, Hollis Mason, right? He seems to be the only one of the Minutemen that got into it strictly based on altruistic reasons. Like, he really wanted to go and help others.
I mean, you can say that, but at the same time, if you take in the Night Owl from the films, in one of the first scenes, he's knocking a guy's teeth out. So while he might be the grinninest and he might be the most pleasant to eat a meal with, he's still very willing to break a man's arm.
The episode title, This Extraordinary Being, is actually from Hollis Mason's writing as he is recounting the original news reports of Hooded Justice, springing into action. And so if he wasn't a willing participant with a bloodlust, he certainly did idolize this character.
A little bit later in the episode, we get a song called We Three. It's another jam from the Ink Spots. This was recorded in 1940. It plays while we watch Will Reeves find a new partnership with Captain Metropolis and potentially a new love interest. And the news of a new child is on his way. Initially, you think the song is going to refer to his wife and his child and his family growing. But when you listen to the lyrics, you're getting a whole different tale. The lyrics state, we three were living all alone, living a memory, my echo, my shadow, and me. Despite the idea that he's becoming a part of a group and maybe his larger goals are going to get addressed, his family is growing, his sort of superhero community is growing. The more it grows, the more he feels increasingly isolated and disconnected, and the more he kind of just withdraws into himself.
Now, the biggest jam on this episode, the only one that I recognized right off the bat, was with Eartha Kitt's "Smoke Gets in Your Eyes."
Yeah, this song was originally recorded in 1933, so that would make it period appropriate. The version Eartha Kitt records takes place in 1952, but it is very much a throwback. Eartha Kitt, she's a famous boundary-shattering entertainer. She's also got a history of wearing a mask, famously as the most famous Catwoman opposite Adam West's Batman. The song lyrics suggest this warning to be wary of your passions. They say that when your heart's on fire, you must realize the smoke gets in your eyes. And later, the song, once this passion has run its course, the lyrics state, so I smile and say, when a lovely flame dies, smoke gets in your eyes, as a sort of acceptance or a redirection of those warnings. Will is told directly by Captain Metropolis as he's standing outside of a crime scene. He says, you're on your own. Will's been blinded up to this point by his passion for this fight to the way that he's constantly marginalized, and then he's instantly enraged by it.
One final thought on that scene where Will Reeves does make his way into the warehouse and begins a killing spree. I don't know if you guys have the same reaction to it. Is we're watching Hooded Justice beat the shit out of people for an entire episode. And you're like, wow, this is pretty intense. And then when he pops off that round and shoots the guy right in the fucking face, it makes you stop and realize that he's been holding back this whole time. Another layer of self-control, and now he's been completely unleashed, and it's a terrifying thing.
Beyond that, there's some threatening acuity with that pistol. The guy doesn't brace himself. He doesn't hold it with two hands. It's one shot, one kill, and I think they're all headshots.
The projectionist.
Oh, that's
he had needed a second shot, so not a perfect score for Will Reeves. Moving on, though, I did have a conversation on Twitter this morning with friend of the pod, Gillian, who initially labeled episode 6 as pure filler. And I told her she was absolutely white about that. And we had a really constructive back and forth about this episode. And in the end, we settled on some truths about this extraordinary being. One truth was that time in the series does not have to move forward for the plot to move forward. And that's evident in the original Watchmen graphic novel. The story is largely told through a series of interrogations and investigations, right? It's looking back to move the story forward. And the other thing that we settled on is that this episode did have several reveals that worked on different levels for different viewers. And the first one, the most obvious one, is Will Reeves being Hooded Justice. So this might seem obvious to a lot of us who noticed the matching color schemes as you did, Raj. I remember when you said, oh, he's wearing the red hoodie and black clothes. And I was like, you're fucking crazy. Well, not so much. Or people who understood the motif of legacy between grandfather and granddaughter, something we've been kind of beaten over the head with, or caught the repeated new symbolism, matched the timelines of when Will Reeves was a cop and where, and kind of made sense of it all. But even Damon Lindelof said on the official Watchmen podcast that he expected us to figure this out around episode 3. King B, to your credit, Raj, to your credit, and many other people had this dialed in right after the pilot. I wasn't there yet. I'm always the skeptic. But you got to remember, all of us, when we kind of scoff at this, we got to remember that there's a whole slew of people just barely piecing the story together. And for them, you know, maybe they're people who talk while watching TV, or like to fold laundry while Watchmen is on, or just aren't massive dorks who obsess over TV. To those guys, this was a big payoff, and it does move the plot forward.
You know, sometimes I take for granted the fact that we are giant nerds and we have read the comic books a couple times. So we have seen all the movies and we were obsessed with the show. Well, while I've been in Florida, I've been staying with my aunt and my uncle. When I come to Orlando and record, I'm still recording over here at Big D's house. And I watched it, the first episode of the HBO series. I was like, guys, you got to really watch Watchmen. Let's give it a shot. And they had not seen the movie. They're not familiar with the comic books at all. And they were lost. They were like, we like the show. Like, it's very interesting, but what does any of this mean? And I was like, well, there's a great podcast you can subscribe to and download and you can listen to. But I had to give them a crash course into the Watchmen because they kept asking me questions throughout the episode of like, who is this? And why are they doing that? And who's this guy? And, you know, how did the wheelchair guy get him into the tree? I was like, I'll explain later. So sometimes we have to sit back and we have to look at this in broad terms and understand that there are people who aren't as obsessed with us.
You know, as you say that, I can't imagine what it must be like to be one of those people that's just come into this with brand new, fresh eyes. I wish I could be those people.
Lindelof actually said that he had talked to a couple, one of whom had read the books and all, and one who came into it fresh, and said that he doesn't even understand how somebody who didn't read the graphic novel or see the movie would appreciate the show at all, and was kind of surprised that people did approach it that way, which I thought was very interesting. Being a guy who says it's not a sequel, but you really should have watched the first part. The other revelation that we get in this episode is confirmation that Judd Crawford was a racist. Looking Glass was right. Judd Crawford was a white man in Oklahoma. As Wade said, he refers to Black Americans as you people. He calls his grandfather's Klan robes his legacy. Judd is what's commonly known as a benevolent racist. And this is something I had to actually explain to my mom, who doesn't believe such a thing exists. The idea here is benevolent racism is the tendency to find members of other races sympathetic, but incompetent. So you're like, yes, they're people. Yes, we should take care of them, but they just can't really take care of themselves. And that's fucking racist. And the thing is, Angela is a product of the 80s. You know, she was born in the 70s, raised in the 80s. She was born in an environment where overt racism, like we saw in this episode, is gone. Her racistometer is not calibrated the way Will's is.
I believe the term is radar.
Oh, I like it. All right. And that's why she accepts Judd. Now, Will is a product of the 30s. So he's seen all this shit before. He saw it when he joined the New York Police Department. He saw it when he joined the Minutemen. He saw it when Captain Metropolis abandoned him. Like, he can see that racism that Angela can't see. And even we as an audience, we were fucking guilty of it, man. We were supportive of Judd. He sings Oklahoma while having dinner with some black people. He goes to a black theater and we're like, oh, so he's a good guy, right? He cares about Angela, so he's a good guy, right? But he also, as you pointed out, Raj, had no black people at his home, after his death. He had KKK robes in the closet. He was likely working in tandem with the current Senator Keene to keep the peace between the 7th Cavalry and the police. This is benevolent racism.
Are we absolutely sure that Judd isn't really trying to do good? I'm almost skeptical because maybe it's just because I have this infatuation with Don Johnson, and go see Knives Out. You get more of John Johnson on the big screen. But I wonder if Will is wrong here. I wonder if Judd really was trying to do something to protect Tulsa from the 7th Cavalry and was trying to work from the inside and is not a benevolent racist.
Well, how about this? Both can be true. He can be a benevolent racist, and he can be working to what he believes is the best outcome for all parties involved.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the ticket. The idea of a benevolent racist, again, is saying that, yes, I'm sympathetic to you. I care about you. I want you to do well. You're incapable of doing this for yourselves. Let my race help your race.
So, I mean, one of the things that I initially thought is, oh shit, could Will Reeves be making a mistake here in killing Judd?
Yeah.
But then you remember, Will Reeves is an angry fucking man who hates all white racists and probably hates white people just by default.
So that brings us to reveal number 3, which is Will Reeves killed Judd Crawford. So again, this is one of those things where we were in denial. He flat out told Angela he did it, but none of us believed him because we didn't know about the magic maglite of mesmerism. But looking back, we all should have seen Judd's death the same way we saw the comedian's death back in 1985. In the graphic novel, the comedian dies at the start of it. And that starts things in motion while leaving 2 questions to be answered. Who killed the comedian? And who was Eddie Blake, really? The comedian as a person, who was he? And here in the show, we learn that Will killed Judd, but we don't know who Judd really was. And that speaks to what you're saying, Raj. This is moving the plot forward. We still don't know who this guy was.
I guess the question that I keep coming back to, and I hope you guys can shed some light onto this, if Will Reeves is truly, he wants to emulate Bass Reeves and he wants to be that good sheriff, why the mob justice? Because Bass Reeves, this idol that he looked up to, says, not today. We got to trust in the law. There won't be mob justice. When he ends up, that's what he does. He uses mob justice to kill Judd.
Well, because back in 1938, Will Reeves decided he'd rather fucking shoot people in the head.
Okay.
He's been turned. He's no longer that guy.
Yeah, Bass Reeves is just another mask that guy wears, this pursuit of truth and justice. He has been harmed and he wants to harm back. Hurt people, hurt people.
One thing I found interesting, and a lot of people pointed it out early on, is Judd's body is missing a shoe. And in the American Hero story, or in the flashbacks, you see the supposed body of Hooded Justice washed up on the shore, and it's also missing, I think, the left shoe. Is that his calling card? If we're supposed to believe that Will Reeves also planted that body and took off the shoe, is that kind of his calling card?
I'm so fucking sick of hearing about this shoe. If there is a connection regarding this shoe, I'm going to be so pissed off.
Agreed.
But here's the thing, Raj. There's so many questions about this killing scene still. Yeah. How does a man hang himself?
I agree.
Why did Judd look like he was beat up? Does a fucking magic flashlight make any sense at all?
If you look at the screen closely, you'll see a little step stool is sitting out there waiting for them as Judd is wheeling him out there.
Yo, you could give me a step stool and then tell me to hang myself from a tree. I'm still going to have a real hard time.
No, you just step off the step stool. I wheel over there. I collect the step stool, put it in my lap, and wheel away. You're hanging. There's no evidence.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
It does make perfect sense. You get the Costco folding step stool.
Right. Those are the best step stools, by the way. If you don't have one, go buy they'll last you forever. But to King B's point, Gene, Looking Glass, who we know is a pretty truthful character, says that there's evidence of a struggle underneath his fingernails. We don't see any of that in this flashback.
It leads me to reveal number 4, which is that Angela was supposed to take these pills.
Correct.
We know that nostalgia requires the user to be scanned at a true clinic. And in order for that to work, for Angela to have seen the night of Judd's death, Will had to get scanned after Judd Crawford died. Then intentionally leave the pills in the car for Angela. And that means that Trieu likely had to be involved too. I was struggling to piece together why they would go through all the effort until longtime listener Tiago suggested a motive. So we see that Will tries to tell Angela everything that's going on, that he killed Judd and convince her of the truth, and she wouldn't listen to him. She didn't believe him. So maybe they had to show her instead. A man in a wheelchair puts out a spike strip, then flashes a magic flashlight in Judd Crawford's eyes. Judd wheels him over to a tree where Judd hangs himself. Then Will would have to call Angela, get arrested, then get scooped up by the sky crane, get his memories scanned, then have the car drop back off with the bottled pills in the glove box for Angela to consume. It's a lot.
No, you just mapped it out. Works out great.
You know, and this is why I was wondering if they were maybe trying to tell us through some visual clues that what Angela was seeing was what they wanted her to see. Why are some memories in color, like his mother playing the piano? That's, you know, one obvious thing that we saw in the beginning of, you know, the pilot episode. That event actually took place. Are they trying to tell us that the color memories, while she's still in this nostalgia world surrounded by the supposed memories of Will Reeves, maybe that's the only true memory? You know, why would they highlight the bodies being drugged by the New York City police car? Why would those bodies be in color, but the police car be in black and white? So I wonder if the nostalgia, those could be false memories served by Trieu, by Will Reeves to set Angela in, you know, on a path of what they want her to do. Like, she's being played. She's a puppet in this overall game.
I think you touched on it, but I see it a little bit differently. The color and the black and white is meant to show us that these memories are mixed from two different eras. There were no bodies being drugged behind the police car. There were bodies being dragged in 1921 Tulsa.
I see what you're saying.
The entirety of your experiences are colored by your past memories. Everything that shows up in color is his memories or his reflections of his past. So while she is viewing his memories, the sensations and the things that he recalls during those instances are the things that show up in color. Those are really the suggested things that are taking place in the actual real life black and white objective events.
And we get a little more of a clue to that when Agent Blake and Cal are talking to Angela as she's kind of slipping in and out of coma, where it's becoming colorized and slipping to black and white again. It's sort of, again, showing us what's present and then what's past, which brings us to reveal number 5. And that's, we find out at the end of this episode that Angela is surprised in Lady Trieu's care. Watchmen held over our heads the threat of Angela dying from an overdose on nostalgia. They kept saying, "Oh, you shouldn't do that. You could die. Angela, you're about to die." I don't think anyone was buying that. Like, they're not fucking killing Angela off. You know what I was thinking at the end of last week was, what's going to happen to Wade? And this episode was so good, I forgot that Wade's got a bunch of gunmen entering his house. So good job distracting us. But I do think we were surprised to find Angela waking up in Lady Trieu's care. And it makes sense considering Trieu's company made the drug and she's a trillionaire with the latest technology. I'm still left to wonder if this is good or bad for Angela and whether the pills being planted in her car were designed to get her into Trieu's custody. Kind of like you said, Raj, even if it wasn't fake memories, specific memories to get her to a certain place. And I don't know if it's a clue, but when Angela wakes up, you can see that Trieu is reading The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, which might signal that she is a libertarian or swings that way, which would put her in political opposition to the current regime. So if you're feeling stagnant on plot at the end of episode 6, like Gillian, maybe this little nugget is meant to push your boat toward the next shore.
I've never read The Fountainhead. What exactly is the Fountainhead about? I mean, I'm familiar with Ayn Rand and this rugged individualism, and that's really the only true path to freedom and liberty. Meanwhile, Ayn Rand was also a hypocrite in the fact that she spent the majority of her life on government care and welfare. Her books weren't really popular till after her death. But like, what was the Fountainhead about?
It was about an architect who basically his opinions on architecture conflict with the establishment, and the establishment's like not willing to accept progress and change. And he's an architect who is, get it, rugged individualist, just like you said, Raj, push against the man. So that's the Fountainhead.
And he really likes fountains.
My final big reveal is the Cyclops. So we finally get a name for that big eye that you, Raj, pointed out way back on that letter from the senior Senator Keene to Judd Crawford's dad. So this is in PDpedia. Raj was like, what's that eye thing all about? Well, we find out. It's called the Cyclops. We also see it again on the wall of the 7th Cavalry hideout in episode 5. And now we see it way back in 1938 as the hallmark of a white supremacist group in New York. Fun story about this is that the writer of this episode, Cord Jefferson, told Sci-Fi Wire in an interview that this episode was actually written before that okay hand gesture took on a racist meaning. So before the alt-right adopted that, they had already started writing this episode. So they called it sort of an unhappy coincidence. But if you get even more creative, you see Cyclops images in the giant squid that wrecked New York, one eye, and likewise the background of that secret Vite tape that the 7th Cavalry shows Looking Glass, again, the squid eye. And if you want to get really Looney Tunes, you could even talk about the Eye of Jupiter, which Adrian Veidt can see from his prison on the moon Europa, the big red eye looking at him from there. So wheels within wheels.
Also, the notion of a singular lens on a movie camera or a mesmerizing maglite.
And buttholes.
One thing the King Bee hates when I do, and this is a little reflectitine, guys, but what if Captain Metropolis and the Minutemen were part of Cyclops? So Captain Metropolis, he seeks out Will Reeves as Will Reeves is getting closer to uncovering what's behind Cyclops and the KKK. We also find out that the whole Minutemen was just a PR stunt. And during that PR, bringing Hooded Justice in, maybe it was a way for them to distract Hooded Justice and control him and distract him from his overall mission of this vast and insidious conspiracy, especially when they uncover that National Bank poster. That was the same poster that was on the wall of the 7th Cavalry trailer in episode 1. And
alleged 7th Cavalry trailer.
That's right. Captain Metropolis, Nelson Gardner, also had a safe behind a photo of a white horse in his boudoir. Could that be the same Comanche horse painting that Judd had up as his house? That was a gift from, confirms Cyclops member Senator Keene.
I think, Raj, you just opened the portal to the hellhole of fan fiction we're about to get from listeners.
Again, yeah, I know it was reflectitine. Thank you, King B, for indulging me. Thank you, Gene, for indulging me. Listen, I haven't been that far off in some of this stuff so far, but I agree. This is wild speculation, but it's fun to talk about.
I just love that we spent a half hour building up all the shit Raj was right on, and then he just jumped off a fucking cliff with that one. So speaking of people writing in, we got a great email from listener Eddie, who wrote, "Guys, I'm a fan of the show. I love your stuff. This was a tough episode to watch, mostly because you had a man, Will, who had so much trauma and anger in his life, try his best to do the right thing, and then always have it turn out badly. The scenes with Metropolis especially hit hard. Within the gay community, it's not uncommon to see slight overtones of racism here and there. Men sometimes put preferences on dating sites where they list the type of men racially they aren't into, and sometimes men get fetishized for their race too. Obviously, the show didn't get too deep into the racism that goes on within the queer community, but I'm glad they touched on it. Will thought he met a person who identifies with him in more ways than one, but when it came down to it, that partnership was shallow. Even today, you have Black trans women being murdered at an alarming rate, and many gay men don't really care or show minimal support. Just saying, I'm glad that they showed that even within marginalized communities, there's still tons of work to be done. Love the pod, Eddie. And Eddie's email really got me thinking about how Watchmen is really getting Under the Mask to the next level. And so I started looking back at comic books. And my initial thought was comic books haven't explored these themes before about being bisexual or gay or being black or having children. But it's not true. In fact, they have, but they just haven't done them in the way that Lindelof is doing. So let's start with the gay thing. Again, here we have a character, Will Reeves, who is gay or possibly bisexual. And in comic books, we do see lots of pansexual characters. There's Loki, Iceman, Wonder Woman, Deadpool, Wiccan, Hulkling, Batwoman. All of them are either queer or have an alternative sexuality. But generally, those characters' sexuality is either superficially addressed or it's idealistically supported. If you go up and ask somebody right now, like, is Deadpool gay?
I mean, only in the most colloquial sense.
Right. Or like Iceman. Like Iceman got his mind read and they found out that he was gay as a teenager, but they don't really explore that any further than gay, and then they leave it alone. In the case of Watchmen, we finally get that intersectional marginalization that Eddie is talking about. Just because two people are gay doesn't mean that one of them isn't marginalized because he's black. There's a point in the show where Captain Metropolis refers to the Minutemen not being understanding of Will Reeves' secret. And I thought he was talking about the homosexuality thing. Mm-hmm. And then you realize as he starts to fold Will's shirt over his black chest, it's like, he's talking about his skin color.
In the episode, Will even asks Captain Metropolis as they're laying there cuddling with each other. He asks the question, when did you know? And I wonder if that was Will, because it's kind of an ambiguous question. I think Captain Metropolis answers with, oh, when did I know that you were Hood of Justice? And then Will says, yeah, that's what I meant. I wonder if he was asking about the gay thing. I wonder if he was asking more about my sexuality. When did you know? Because, again, the 1930s, from what I understand, I didn't live back then, was not a very accepting time, number one, to be a minority, but also not to be gay.
Oh, yeah?
And I think that's the mask that Captain Metropolis wears.
Yeah, I mean, just look at what they did to fucking Alan Turing, like a goddamn hero,
right?
You know, and he was absolutely persecuted. The other thing that we look at in this episode is the idea of a superhero being black, and again, black superheroes exist, but that didn't even happen until 1966 with Black Panther, and until very recently, those characters only existed because of their blackness. It was like, hey, look at this black comic book, you know. In Watchmen, we have Hood of Justice kicking the whole damn thing off. He was the original. He's the OG. And Sister Night is undeniably the hero of the show. And I think my only gripe, if you can call it that, is that all the black characters are related. The only thing that offsets that is Watchmen has done something remarkable, which is taken black vigilantes and allowed them to be angry and brutal and conflicted. This isn't Luke Cage. This is a lot further than that. You know, they're allowed to be killers and terrifying and out of control. The final thing that I wanted to touch on is heroes having kids. It's something that, with the theme of legacy, is a natural extension of this show. But barring alternate timelines and, you know, weird magic-y stuff, most superheroes don't have children. And when they do have children, we don't see them parenting. So I was surprised, actually, when I did some research on this, that I was like, Spider-Man had a kid. Batman had a kid, but they're never like considered like in the main canon, right? You don't watch, you know, a Batman movie and see Batman and his kids, right? You don't see Spider-Man and his kids in you know, the movies. In Watchmen, we see Angela raising 3 kids with Cal. Lady Trieu is raising Bian. Will Reeves and his wife June are raising Marcus, and Sally Jupiter has Laurie Blake. And so we get to touch on this part of the heroism, or of the hero's home life, where we see their successes and failures as parents, and it tells you more about their psyche, and it weighs on them much more heavily, living with the legacy of your parents, or having to raise a child while also trying to, you know, save the world. It reminded me a lot of how The Sopranos really dared to explore mobsters' home life for the first time, and that's what made that show great.
Yeah, before we get listeners writing in or calling in with their actuallys, we do understand that Damian Wayne is the son of Bruce Wayne, even though he was raised by Ra's al Ghul and his mother,
Talia.
Yeah. You didn't actually see Batman raising Damian Wayne until he was already a badass, you know, crime fighter and could be, you know, his third Robin. So yes, there are superheroes who do have their their sons and fighting there with them.
It was really interesting to see that scene where Will Reeves comes home and finds his son dressing up as him. You know, a child is supposed to look up to their parent. There's no secret kept from the boy that this is what his dad does. And when what his dad does is a thing he's ultimately not proud of, or he no longer feels is something to be an exemplar for, just that reaction and that interaction, I think, is real good material.
Do you think that he was angry at his son for dressing up as Hooded Justice, or do you think he was upset that his son felt the need to put on white paint over his face?
The fact that he has to put white paint on his own face is his shame. He's
right.
He hates that he has to do that. And the
I
fact
agree.
that his son, I mean, he hates every aspect of his life, that he's not respected in his career. He's constantly marginalized amongst people that are supposed to be his peers. And then he comes home and sees his son who's about to walk down that same path, you know, in the way that he's emulating him. And he'll do any goddamn thing to make sure his kid does not live the way he lived.
So the show closes with Angela waking up and Lady Trieu looking over her. After 2 episodes of origin stories, it seems like we're going to move the plot forward headlong. And we're left to wonder, what is Lady Trieu's intent? What is she all about? And it seems that she's going to be a focal point in the next episode.
Yeah. And so if you would indulge me here, we're getting a lot of feedback on Twitter. Like, how are they going to wrap this up in 3 episodes? Are we going to spend another full episode on learning Lady Trieu's backstory? We see in the upcoming previews for next week's episode 7, that it appears as if they're really going to focus on the Watchtower and Angela finding and discovering secrets about the Watchtower and a little bit Lady Trieu. So it could be that we are going to get some backstory in Lady Trieu, or they could have thrown this all up on PDpedia. The third item, there's some clues into Lady Trieu's background. And so if they're not going to spend an entire episode on Lady Trieu, I thought maybe we'd go in and we kind of explain how some of that PDpedia article relates to Lady Trieu's background and give some more context into what I feel is going to be the overarching villain of the story, kind of the Ozymandias of the HBO series. So I'm going to quickly go through this. I'm not going to go into depth, but you can see this on HBO PDpedia. It's almost like it's a reading from like a People magazine, if you will. I think this is from like the Talk of Tulsa, and the headline is Lady Trieu, Fact or Fiction. And it's not even Lady Trieu being interviewed. It's just a PR person. So take this with a grain of salt. A lot of the stuff we've talked about in prior episodes, but the first item was Lady Trieu's mother was a looning parenting guru. They say that this was a fact. So Lady Trieu was raised by, get this, her mother, who was named Bian, who, if you recall, her daughter's also, her daughter clone, if you will, is also named Bian. And she raised Lady Trieu in a manner that she was very hard on her. She wanted to raise the smartest woman in the world, brighter than a sky full of stars. And her inspirations were the liberators and architects of Pax America, Nixon, Manhattan, the comedian Adrian Veidt. What that tells me is that Bien Mai was affected by the imperialism during the Vietnam War and Dr. Manhattan, and was raising almost kind of like an evil version of Ozymandias. Your guys' thoughts?
This actually kind of flies in the face of what I think I and a lot of people assumed about Lady Trieu, which is that she witnessed the violence perpetrated by the Americans and was railing against that. But again, if the inspirations included Adrian Veidt and the comedian and Dr. Manhattan and Richard Nixon, then it would seem, in fact, that there was a desire to be more like them.
But she's also launched over 50 Voyager-class probes into the galaxy, and we saw on Europa, one of those probes that passes by Europa. I wonder if that could be one of Lady Trieu's satellites. There was some speculation on Twitter and in the ether of individuals that watched the show that Lady Trieu's father was the comedian. They bring this up in this article. They say it's fiction, although they did have dozens of little Eddies. They did confirm there's dozens of little Eddies. Maybe one was supposedly in Vietnam's prominent post-statehood citizens. They're on record as saying that Lady Trieu has no father, but Lady Trieu's mother, Bien, experienced the massacre in her village that was led by the comedian and his goons of commandos. Those blazing commandos passed through her village. So I think there's definitely a connection there.
And this would tie to young Bien, so Lady Trieu's daughter, who talks about, again, how her feet hurt and everything else, and the men coming through and burning the village, which, I referenced back after that episode that this seemed to be a recollection of My Lai. And so if that's the case, if the My Lai massacre is being recalled by this child, and in fact, Bien Mi was the one who actually witnessed this would now be a memory passed down through 2 generations.
While we're in this pit stop, can I also recall our viewer that wrote in and reminded us that it's pronounced Trieu? I listened, pal. I listened.
Again, there's much more to read on Peteypedia. If you want to know a little bit more about Lady Trieu and draw your own conclusions, check that out on their website. But thank you guys for letting me indulge. I think there's some good information there, and we're going to get some. I think that's going to lead into the next couple episodes.
Yeah, and Raj, speaking of Lady Trieu, moving on to the odds and ends of the episode, Lindelof has said that episode 7 will pick up with Angela and Trieu's care. We've seen that also in the previews for the next episode. But another interesting thing that I don't know if he let slip, he kind of just muttered it in there during the official Watchmen podcast, is that farm crash that we witnessed where Lady Trieu bought the Clark farm from Lois Clark and her husband. The thing that crashes into the field, that storyline will be resolved in the finale. So we're going to have to wait all the way until episode 9.
For the record, addressing our previous or Instacast email that we received, I thought we were the official Watchmen podcast.
Gene, yeah.
I don't grab anybody else's ideas.
Hopefully no one can accuse me
me
of stealing other people's ideas with my reflectitine. Gene, you bring up a good point about the Clark farm and the crash landing, how that won't be resolved until the finale. One thing we did learn that's kind of an odds and ends is that Superman does exist as a comic book character at this time, of which Hooded Justice draws comparisons to Superman. The fact that he was inspiration for other superheroes. One journalist even asks him, there's rumors that you have superhero abilities. Can you talk more about that? In fact, his wife June, who is confirmed as that was the little girl that he rescued in the first episode, he ends up marrying. She's a journalist, right? She's kind of the Lois Lane to Clark Kent. And as other people have pointed out, King B, you did, is that ultimately those types of comic books, those superhero comic books, once the Minutemen were created, they kind of fell out of favor. And then those comic book stories moved towards things like pirates and other things. So I thought that was interesting that, again, for a DC world universe that we're living in, there is, an actual Superman and, kind of relates back to that Lady Trieu episode of going and giving the baby to the farmers. Another odds and ends is that Hooded Justice in the market, he throws that KKK member into romaine lettuce. We saw romaine lettuce being, part of the 7th Cavalry. And I don't know if that was a callback or something more.
Yeah, I caught that. I think it was just that they had their props department. And they're like, we need to put some shit on the shelves. We got a fuck ton of lettuce from that truck.
And then finally, the first real success of Hooded Justice was saving the couple, not necessarily the break-in to that market. It almost reminded me of Thomas and Martha Wayne, where he rescues them from muggers as they're returning from the theater. I didn't know if you guys caught that as well.
Yeah, there's a reason for that. So writer Cord Jefferson was basically trolling comic book origin stories, because in every single comic book origin story, whatever happens. And then the guy's walking down an alley and then some lady's like, help. And it's always got to be some low level hoods that they got to beat up first. And something always goes wrong, right? Like it's never quite ideal. Then they learn from their mistakes. Batman, Spider-Man, everybody goes through the same shit.
Or it could be a cyborg police officer that saves and shoot someone's dick off.
It absolutely could. It scars me for life. Psychologically.
Well, those were all my odds and ends. But again, great episode. Thanks everyone for listening, and thank you guys for indulging me.
Yeah. So once again, on an episode where nothing happened and there's nothing to talk about, we sure had a lot to talk about. And that concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Watchmen. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcast. The website is shatontv.com. If you'd like to email us for our newsstand edition, which will come out later this week, you could write in at hosts@shatontv.com. Again, thank you for everyone who has been writing in and calling in when they're in their cabins and can't get internet access. Really, really appreciate that. We're everywhere fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you do stop by iTunes, please leave a review that helps the podcast grow. Also, several people have either tweeted or written in and said, I didn't know that you had whatever episode popping up, whether it was an Instacast that just came up out of surprise or a spinoff, a newsstand edition. One way to make sure you get all of them is to subscribe. If you subscribe to the podcast, you will get every episode. They're free. You can throw them away if you don't want them. It's okay. So again, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe, tell a friend. On behalf of my co-hosts, the King Bee and Roger Roper, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us later this week for our episode 6 Watchmen Newsstand. Thanks for listening. Have a great night.
Happy Thanksgiving.